was all along. Right? So in England, they needed cotton. Well, when the United States became an independent country, and particularly after the Civil War, in which the allies of the British in the South were defeated, even though the British helped them, the British understood, these Americans are not our friends. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to start producing cotton themselves. They're going to take their own cotton, make their own cotton cloth, and we're going to be shafted. Solution, we got to get cotton out of our empire, not from the United States. And so the British went to work and planted cotton in every single colony the British had. They tried it everywhere. Where it worked, the country became a cotton producer. And where it didn't, the country didn't. Uganda produces cotton because the British planted it there. Egypt produces cotton because the British planted it there. Tanganyika, what's now called Tanzania, they tried cotton, didn't go well. So Tanzania's history is built around something else which the British could market, called coffee. Kenya coffee. Kenya Robusta coffee. Right? Sisal. Tea, no cotton, cotton's in Uganda, etc. Okay, so in every colony, the government is playing a central role deciding what's produced, how it's produced, and everything else. With independence, 1945, immediately after the war, many of these countries became independent. Did they shift from a state capitalism to a private capitalism? No. They didn't have enough private capitalism. First of all, with independence, the Europeans that were there often withdrew. And the Africans or the Asians or whoever they were that were in the colony had not yet developed in most of these places. And even if they had developed an industry, for example in India they had, it still needed a lot of help in a world that was no longer protected as they had been in the British Empire, but was now an open market situation. So the government was called in. So in the early years, the early decades after 45, state capitalism of the colonial kind gave way to state capitalism of the independent kind. But again, by the 70s and 80s, when a crisis of that kind of capitalism hit, they all oscillated over. They all became private capitalists. Most famous example that you can read about was the famous shift in the government in Chile, in Latin America, where things had gotten to such a point that in response to the difficulties in the late 60s and 70s, the Chilean state capitalism moved to the left. Rather than a swing to the right, they moved to the left. They elected a socialist, Salvador Allende. And then he was promptly murdered with, it looks like, at least the United States is, what's the word I want? Benevolent involvement, let's call it, whatever that means. And he was killed and thrown out, and in came two interesting groups that reshaped Chile. One was the military, a man named Pinochet, some of you read about, who became the dictator for many years, and what were called the Chicago Boys, Milton Friedman's students who came into Chile and redesigned, got rid of state capitalism, which they hate. They're on the other side of that debate, and they refixed Chile, and as they did with many governments in Latin America, to make them neoliberal. Open up the economy, let foreign investors come in, decontrol prices, make the government smaller, cut back, so all of that. And that didn't wait till 2008. That already fell apart around this time. And Latin America, as these private capitalisms had harder and harder time, began the shift to the left. Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez, those of you who pay attention, a whole movement that makes Latin America one of the most left-looking places in the world right now, as it moves back into a state capitalism trying to cope with the situation. So, we've had these oscillations. In each of these countries, the struggle between those who want the government in and those who want it out is rerun. Each country has its own unique way, its own traditions, its own culture, its own way of posing the problem, but they all pose the same problem. And always lurking on the edges of this debate is the third position, which is a pox on both of you. We're not interested. We're the Marxists, we're the socialists, we're the leftists. We're not interested in debating which kind of capitalism we're going to have. Because we watch this history. We know that whichever one we have, it'll hit a crisis after a while, because that's how capitalism is, and then we'll have an oscillation back to the other one, and meantime, it's just a different set of people who get screwed, or if you're really unlucky, the same set of people get screwed with each one. And this is a system that has outlived its historical usefulness and needs to be replaced by something altogether different. And then they have different definitions of what that altogether different will be. They give it names like socialism, communism, and a whole bunch of other names. And they have quite varying notions of what this is. But they all mean it to be radically different, not just from private capitalism, but from state capitalism as well. They're not Keynesians. They don't want to enter that debate. And in some countries, they're very strong. In Bolivia now, for example, they're very strong. In Germany now, there's a real struggle between the Keynesian types, who are still stronger, and the anti-Keynesian far left, which is rising fast and literally feeding off the defections from the old Keynesian types. We have a new political party there called the Die Linke, the left. There's a new party like it forming in France, which takes an interesting name. I don't know how many of you pay attention, but there are actually two new parties forming on the left in France, and they both take the name Anti-Capitalist Party. What an interesting idea. It's as if they want to be real clear what their position is, so nobody has to worry or wonder. Because the word socialist, has become kind of fuzzy. So they want to be real clear. And so, the left, Die Linke in Germany means the left, and the French are literally calling it le Parti Anticapitaliste, the French anti-capitalist party. And it's very interesting that the same is happening slowly in Italy and in some of the local Benelux countries and so forth. Meant by the term crisis, that we have a clear sense of what the word economic crisis means, as we will be using it, and as you will see it referred to, more or less of what I'm about to tell you is what is meant. Let's begin by two preliminary comments. First, a crisis in a capitalist system can and often does start in the most varied places. It can start anywhere. What makes it a crisis is not where it starts, but how far it spreads. In that, again, I can use the metaphor of disease. Having a rash on your elbow is a rash on your elbow. When it spreads to all the rest of your skin, it's become a crisis. And now something is going on that demands a kind of attention that the rash on your elbow by itself wouldn't have. So where can a crisis occur? Let me just give you some examples, and I could spend an hour doing it. I won't. If exports drop, suppose the exports of a society suddenly drop. Either drop because nobody buys this stuff anymore, or drop in another sense. People still buy this stuff, but they won't give you any money for it. Some historical examples, real quick. Suppose in the United States, we had a new scare. You know the kind of scares we have these days? Think peanut butter. Right? But suppose it weren't peanut butter. Suppose it were coffee. Suppose tomorrow there's a front page headline across America, eating coffee makes your hair fall out. Right? Suddenly an awful lot of people would find something else to drink quickly. Just like those of you that are peanut butter addicts, hopefully, have changed your ways, at least for a while. That would be, take a country like Colombia. We have a major crisis. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? You have just removed something their whole economy depends on. I understand, some of you are aware that Colombia sells another product, but we're not going to discuss that. We're going to focus on the coffee. Okay. Sometimes this kind of crisis can become an object of foreign policy. After Castro made his revolution in Cuba, the United States said we will no longer buy sugar. Cuba depended on the export of sugar. They depended on the export of sugar above all to the rich North American market. This was an intentional attempt to throw the economy into crisis in the hopes that would get rid of Castro. So it didn't work. By the way, why? How did Cuba solve the problem of the sudden loss of its export market on which it completely depended? Any of you know? Russia bought it. Notice, so here was an event, could have been a crisis. If Russia had not done that, for whatever reason, then Cuba, God knows what would have happened, and probably there'd be no Castro either. So something started, but it didn't necessarily spread. In this case, something else was done so that this thing, this rash in your arm, didn't become a rash on your whole body. This loss of it, but in another situation, and in another country, it could be a disaster. For example, I'll give you another one. Saudi Arabia is in trouble now, big trouble. Why? Because in another sense, it lost its export market. Saudi Arabia depends on one thing. Just one. Not even 1.5. Just one. Oil. It sells oil. A year ago, 8 months ago, oil was $145 a barrel. Today, oil is $37 a barrel, whatever it's selling for today. But that's the order of magnitude. That means Saudi Arabia is getting a whole hell of a lot less money for the oil. Plus, since they're trying to drive up the price of oil, Saudi Arabia has been cutting back on production. So they're selling less oil at a much reduced price. Saudi Arabia is in deep doo-doo. And their country is in trouble. Other examples. Investments falls. Businesses don't see enough money to be made. They don't think there's enough profit to be made. They decide not to invest. If they decide not to invest, they don't hire people. They don't buy stuff. They don't expand the factory. And that can be a real problem. Consumers can do it. Suppose consumers decided, which by the way is going on now, that they needed to save more money, that we've just been spending too much money, and that's how we got into this trouble. That's how my family has so much debt, and that's why. So I'm gonna save. I'm not gonna. Maybe some of you have actually